On an otherwise normal day, a buoy was placed in the Mediterranean Sea several hundred feet off the coast. It was placed there as a marker to direct a new travel channel, open for local ships and fishermen that had previously been a no-take zone restricted from most human activity. The buoy bobbed lifelessly up and down, side to side, secured in place by a chain anchored to the sea's floor. As time passed, the buoy was noticed more and more by schools of fish that lived in the surrounding water. Simultaneously, fishermen began fishing around and near the buoy, which had begun to train the fish to correlate the seemingly new occurrence of fish being pulled up and out of the surface with the newly introduced thing that was, in this case, the buoy. As time continued to pass and more fish were getting pulled up and out of the water, some fish became curious as to what exactly the constant, ominous, and glowing thing was that seemed to be the source. Some braver fish would go up to the buoy in hopes for answers, but it would seem to just loom over them silently like an all-powerful deity of the sea. Eventually, one fish in particular came to the conclusion that the buoy must be watching and rewarding them when they were doing something right, taking them to a paradise filled with infinite more delicious food. It shared this explanation with its school, and since there were no other explanations, and this one sounded pretty nice, it was obvious to the school that this fish must be right. Simultaneously, another fish of a different school, also trying to make sense of the buoy, came to a similar conclusion. However, it deemed that the buoy was not rewarding them when they were doing something right, but rather punishing them when they were doing something wrong, and taking them to a horrible place above the surface. This fish shared this explanation with its school, and out of the fear of it being true, the school agreed that it must be. At some point, fueled by fear of either possibilities, both interpretations had begun to spread out across and into other local schools of fish, each adopting one of the two views or some derivative combination of both. The occasional fish that seemed to be thrown back into the water from the surface could only describe the experience as a powerful white blinding light and surreal sense of something beyond, which only further fueled all beliefs equally. Over time, otherwise friendly and interconnected schools of fish became further and further isolated from one another, each separating themselves by their schools of thinking. Those who believed that the buoy was rewarding them determined that they must act in certain ways, which sometimes, oftentimes, contradicted with the ways in which those who believed it was punishing them acted. And for those who believed it was some mix of both or neither, acted in contradictory assortments of all of the above. Of course, since in actuality there was no direct correlation, it was equally easy for all schools to find and interpret the same moments as support for their pre-existing conclusions, so long as they mostly ignored the moments that weren't. During some especially absurd periods, some schools of fish even fought with each other, sometimes killing each other in the name of their beliefs, feeling justified in their need to rescue or maintain the demands and judgments of the buoy and preserve their potential reward. Eventually, after not really understanding any existing view, a more skeptical and astute fish noticed that the fish that were being taken never really seemed to be doing anything different than the fish that weren't, and it determined that there was no proof of anything intentionally doing anything. And since there was no proof, the fish concluded that the buoy wasn't even real at all. When this fish explained this to its school, most of the school denied and shunned it out of fear and its inability to explain what was happening. But some, few, thought it made perfect sense and was obviously the truth. These fish formed their own new school, which of course did not sit well with the other older schools. Ultimately, each school was unmistakably sure of their own interpretations and conclusions, and thus all simultaneously sure that all other schools were ignorant and inferior. After much continued division and conflict, at one point, an elder fish came forward in an effort to restore peace and sanity to the surrounding waters. This particularly wise fish concluded that the contradictory interpretations meant only one thing: they didn't and couldn't know the nature or whims of the buoy. Many of the fish already on the fence or outside of believing in the buoy found this to be by far the most reasonable conclusion and thus agreed that it was obviously true. One would have expected this school to help, but since their argument was that they were certain they could not be certain of anything, other schools proceeded to argue against this certainty of no certainty. How can you know that you can't know? Other shrewd fish of opposing schools would argue, unaware that such a takedown claim also sort of destroyed their own belief along with it. Ultimately, nothing really changed. The fish continued on, insufferable and in constant conflict with each other. Of course, the last elder fish was correct. They could not know for sure. They could not know that the buoy was a lifeless, hollow shaping of wood and iron, placed there to tell fishermen where they could go, a very real thing with a purpose that certainly had something to do with the fish generally, while simultaneously having nothing to do with any of the fish specifically. But since they could not know this for sure, they could not know for sure that they could not know this for sure either, and the other fish were sort of correct too. When it came to matters of the buoy, the fish simply did not have the capacity to perceive, know, or understand. There was, of course, like in all living things, an upper limit to their awareness that prevented them from being able to comprehend the notions of fishermen and fish hooks and fishing lines and buoys and nice seafood eateries with confused, hungry humans, and the way in which all of these things work together. The only ultimate truth that the fish had access to was that they did not have access to any ultimate truth, which trapped them all in a horrible, absurd paradox of their own limited intelligence. The problem was not really their limited awareness, though, but how the fish responded to it. What was most insufferable about almost all of the fish wasn't so much their individual interpretations, but their constant need to be right and their certainty that, at any given time, in any given view, they were. Obviously, some interpretations were far more ridiculous and harmful than others, but even many of the wiser fish often exhibited the same tendency to lack any humility and skepticism in their own. It's not that a single truth of the buoy didn't exist, and it's not that the fish shouldn't have wanted and tried to find it. But ultimately, the problem with the believing fish was the same for most of the non-believing fish. In every definitive belief or belief in no belief, there existed an arrogance so incongruent with the humility that should so obviously come with being a fish. And only the few schools of fish, which did exist, who knew that they were likely almost always wrong, were ever right.